Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the military leader of Burkina Faso, is setting himself apart from other African leaders. In a continent where leaders have recklessly taken billions of loans from the IMF and the World Bank, Traoré is one of the few who have had the courage to break this pattern. Recent reports have surfaced online indicating that Traoré has refused financial assistance from the IMF. This is a significant and commendable move that shows Traoré's commitment to safeguarding his country's long-term interests. It is crucial to note that taking loans from international organizations, such as the IMF and the World Bank, has been a common practice among African leaders for decades. However, these loans often come with harsh conditions that have had severe repercussions for the borrowing countries. Traoré, unlike other leaders, understands this and is taking decisive action to prevent his country from falling into a debt trap. Ibrahim Traoré has a strong conviction that the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank are nothing but economic oppressors. In his view, these organizations are structured in a way that ensures countries remain in a state of perpetual debt. The IMF and the World Bank use their lending power to gain control over the economies of countries that borrow from them. Once a country becomes indebted to these institutions, it becomes virtually impossible for it to break free from their influence. This level of control gives these organizations a significant amount of power over the politics of the country. He believes that African countries that are dependent on these organizations will never achieve economic freedom. They will continue to be mere shadows of the American economy as long as they remain under the control of the IMF and the World Bank. As the youngest president in Africa, Ibrahim Traoré has been vocal in his criticism of African leaders who are nothing but puppets under the influence of the West. He has made it clear that he will not tolerate any form of Western intervention in his country's affairs. To better understand why Ibrahim Traoré refused the financial aid from the IMF, it is worth noting that around the same time when the news of his rejection was spreading, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso went live on television and delivered a 30-minute-long lecture. During his speech, Apollinaire Kilem, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, made some interesting points. In his opinion, it is better to be poor in a rich and strong state than rich in a poor and weak state. The current poverty of Black Africa is partly due to attempts to corporalize leaders and destabilize regimes. To build a strong state, it is necessary to be able to play out the traps conceived by the dominators to make our states weak, malleable at will. Among these traps, there are three that need to be analyzed. These are the so-called respect for human rights, the so-called respect for freedom of expression, and the neo-colonial institutions of our modern states. He then went on to explain that human rights were an instrument of control of third-world societies in the service of the West. They allow the West to have the guarantee that its local valleys, some of which are directly financed by the West, others indirectly by distorted procedures, will have all the latitude to carry out their activities in order to infiltrate state apparatus and weaken our states for the benefit of the West. Finally, he cited examples of countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Iran, which have been able to face all attempts at destabilization due to their strong states and visionary policies of their leaders. The Prime Minister articulated a detailed perspective regarding the state of fundamental and human rights in their country as compared to the West. They emphasized that in their nation, fundamental rights are yet to be fully addressed, highlighting the essential aspects of human rights, including ensuring access to food, healthcare, education, and adequate housing for the population. The Prime Minister criticized the stance of the West, pointing out that Western nations do not view these basic human rights as adequately met in their countries. They further highlighted the disparity in treatment when it comes to human rights violations, mentioning that while violations in the West are often overlooked or handled with measures to maintain order, similar violations in other regions are subject to severe condemnation. The Prime Minister drew attention to perceived double standards, citing examples such as the United States actions where individuals deemed a threat to national security are eliminated without due process, with little international scrutiny on these human rights violations. They also referenced historical and recent instances of foreign interventions by global powers like the United States and France in various countries, pointing out actions that were detrimental to local populations. The Prime Minister specifically mentioned France's involvement in coups d'etat in Africa, particularly in French-speaking African nations, as well as its alleged support for terrorism in the Sahel region, resulting in significant loss of life and ongoing challenges for the affected populations. Within France itself, the Prime Minister highlighted instances of domestic unrest and government actions, pointing to the Yellow Vest protests of 2018 and the controversial death of Jean Nahel in 2023, which led to further social upheaval. They criticized the use of excessive force and alleged torture during the suppression of protests, suggesting a lack of accountability for human rights violations within France. The Prime Minister pointed out the perceived indifference or silence from international bodies and media regarding these violations, raising concerns about the selective focus on human rights issues based on geopolitical interests. In addressing the broader implications of these observations, the Prime Minister underscored the need for a more consistent and universal approach to upholding human rights principles across the globe. They called for greater accountability for all nations, irrespective of their geopolitical significance, emphasizing the importance of promoting ethical governance and respecting the fundamental rights of individuals. Overall, the statement by the Prime Minister offers a critical examination of the complexities and challenges surrounding human rights discourse, highlighting the need for a more inclusive and equitable approach to addressing violations and ensuring the protection of human rights for all individuals. The Prime Minister went on and expressed concern over the restrictions on freedom of expression in the West. The Prime Minister pointed out that since the Russia-Ukrainian conflict broke out, several Western countries, including France, have expelled Russian press organs from their territories. Moreover, the Lady of Sochi has been banned from entering and staying in France for expressing her opinion. In another incident, an activist lost their French nationality for expressing their views. On March 20th, a local French elected official was suspended simply for accepting to observe the Russian presidential scrutiny. The Prime Minister questioned the West's commitment to freedom of expression and suggested that it is not the freedom of expression that the West defends, but rather their ideological, political, and economic interests. The Prime Minister further argued that the so-called freedom of expression and human rights are often used as means to achieve these interests in their countries. While human rights are better respected in their countries than in Arab Muslim countries, where freedom of belief does not exist, and women lack the freedom of movement and choice of life, it is concerning that the West turns a blind eye to these violations when it serves their interests. The Prime Minister also criticized the local imperialists who claim to value freedom of expression but refuse to grant it to those who disagree with them. They use social media platforms to spread their propaganda and block any comments that do not align with their views. The Prime Minister emphasized that real freedom of expression requires the courage to accept it for others, even those with opposing views. Those who use freedom of expression to harm others are a threat to society, and their actions undermine the progress of their country. The Prime Minister went on and warned against institutional mimicry, which is a trap that many third-world countries, especially French-speaking countries, fall into. The Prime Minister urged the West to uphold their commitment to freedom of expression and human rights, not just when it serves their interests, but as a fundamental principle. In his remarks, Apollinaire Quilem expressed his concern that the West is trying to impose its own history and institutions on other cultures without consideration for their unique histories, cultures, and aspirations. He believes that these institutions are like corsets that restrict the freedom and development of other societies, leaving them under the control of the West like a master keeps a dog. Quilem argues that the West has control over the states and societies of other cultures through these institutions that are intended for the consumption of the dominated peoples. He believes that human rights, freedom of expression, and institutional mimicry are products made in the West that are not necessarily applicable to other cultures. According to Quilem, African societies had their own institutions that were adapted to their unique needs and were regulated according to the needs of society. These institutions allowed them to set up great kingdoms with finesse of organization that still surprises human intelligence. Quilem believes that before revisiting these institutions, African societies must first revisit their own mentalities that have been shaped by centuries of mental and cultural alienation. He argues that to build strong states and assess the stability of institutions,